And your chair for today, as you have shown, with me is Maya, Ifzal, Arif, Jason, Alia, and Holmes. Before we start, a few clarification on house rules. Please leave the room only in between speeches, so as not to disrupt this speaking, the person speaking. And also, please turn off or put your phone on silent. All right. So, are you guys ready? Oh, okay. Okay, it's done. Alright, it starts complete. Okay. With the motion, this House believes that former colonial powers should pay compensation to their former colonies where governments have failed. I invite the Prime Minister.
Ladies and gentlemen, the first thing we need to clarify in today's debate the responsibility of colonizing a country. We think you should leave doing or being a responsible country and actually doing what you're supposed to and the stance that you've taken, right? So let's take a look at the issue in today's debate. What exactly are we supposed to debate about, right? So we think that these countries who actually, these colonial powers actually took responsibility, that they actually wanted to go into these countries to help them develop, right? So we think that that's responsibility taken, but we think they fail in providing what they're supposed to, they fail in reaching their goal, and we think that they should pay the price for that. But more importantly, right, what are countries that have failed? We think countries that have failed should be contextualized to countries that are underdeveloped, yet they still have gone through colonial powers that have ruled them before. So we think that countries such as Timor-Leste should be brought forth in today's debate, because we see that the economy is never going to reach, hasn't reached a point where they can be economically stable around the whole country, and we think that the poverty rate is still really dangerous, right? So we think that the preferable law that we want to impose in today's debate, right? We think that if you're going to, the compensation that should be paid should be at least 50% of to help them develop, right? Because we think that we believe that still are external factors that may have led to the idea of the economical downfall, but we still think that these colonial powers hold a great influence and had caused a lot of damage to the economical state or the country in the developmental state that it should have been in, right? So we concede that there may be external factors, but still there are they still hold a fault in this, right? So before I move on to my argumentations, here's the stand that we want to take, right? We're going to prove to you what's in the best interest of the colonized countries. Before that, any of you guys?
Yes. Are you now agreeing that you want to breach the sovereignty of the country who has already gained independence in the first place?
Look, we think that after this country has already claimed independence, it doesn't necessarily mean that they can't receive compensation, right? Because there's not a breach of sovereignty, is it? We think that you're not really harming the legislative office or status quo itself. When you cause damage to certain things, you have to pay for it back, right? I think that there's never been a breach of sovereignty, because in that case, there wouldn't be any ideas of that happening. Sit down. But more importantly, let's take a look at the argumentations coming from outside. We're going to talk to you about how it's the responsibility of these colonial powers, right? First of all, we clarified already that these colonial powers are the ones who go into the country with the sole excuse that they want to help develop these countries, right? But what exactly happens then? They actually infiltrate the sovereignty of the country initially and go through all of that for the sole purpose of helping them develop. At that point, right, they're actually deceiving parts of society, telling them that we're coming to our country, don't be afraid, we're going to help you. But what exactly happens after that, right? When they don't reach their goal, what exactly happens then? We think that when they go through the whole idea of colonizing, you have to go through killing and invading and things like that, right? So what exactly happens then? It forms no purpose at the end of the day, right? You have no outcome. So all I think it puts you in a bad idea of societal perception, and that's extremely harmful. Before that, Tariq.
Firstly, you characterize colonization as going in to help that country. After that, you said colonization is going in and infringing sovereignty. So what is colonization?
Colonization at an initial level is when you go in for the sole excuse of actually trying to help this country develop, reaching their sovereignty at that point of time. But when you pay compensation, that's not exactly colonization anymore. So that's exactly what they have to understand in today's debate, right? But more importantly, on the idea of societal perception and what's really bad here, right? We think that these countries now, these colonial powers actually seem as a dictatorial force, right? A sadistic force, because their presence has been highlighted by the world and they've been recognized for their faults against this country, right? So at that point of time, they're being recognized globally as someone who's not claiming responsibility for something they've done wrong. I think that's extremely harmful, because after the sadistic things that they had to undergo, right? We think that's extremely harmful. More importantly, especially when they actually highlight the fact that they go in to actually help develop, yet nothing happens. We think that's when society gets a message that it was for the sole reason of exploitation. We think that's extremely harmful. So at that point of time, at a global level, right, you actually exacerbate or magnify the idea of racial conflict towards these colonial powers that already exist, right? But more importantly, we think that what exactly happens then is these colonial powers still have the responsibility, even if opposition were to argue that these were the previous leaders, right? We think that still, at that point of time, you're still representing that country that actually went to the colonial state, right? Who actually colonized a different country. You're still representing that country, and that country still is liable for that kind of harm that they have caused, right? But more importantly, what exactly happens under our paradigm, right? When we put them in a state where they actually take responsibility for their actions, we think that under our paradigm, society sees these colonial powers as an evolutionary. They feel as though it was passed from their past leaders and things like that. We think that now people understand that these countries actually did go in for the right purpose, but maybe they have failed. We think that these kind of external factors are highlighted better under our paradigm, right? We think that's exactly what we want to achieve at the end of the day. Last one, I'll take one from Yan.
Okay, I'm here. So
Okay.
you're trying to expect that this country is going to be evolutionary, but how? Since when people have an interpretation that this country cannot be independent and cannot carry themselves by their own, don't you think that's contradictory?
No, we're talking about the colonial powers that actually seem as evolutionary when they actually go in and take when they actually pay the price for what they've done and what their country has done to a different state. That's exactly when they are perceived as someone who's taking responsibility for something that they feel is not. That's when they're perceived to be responsible, and that's when they're perceived to be someone who's actually valuable, someone who actually values the idea of colonization, and the person who actually wants to take responsibility for that is actually the idea of the fact that he was actually discriminated once because of the fact that his previous leaders maybe had gone through the idea of exploitation towards these countries, right? We think that's exactly the problem that he needs to fix. So that's exactly what we've done, and here's what I've done in my speech, right? We told you exactly, we've eliminated the idea how they may come out of external factors. We told you, and we've also preempted the idea on how it's not their responsibility, right? But more importantly, we fulfill our stance in how we're going to prove to you what's in the best interest of these colonized countries, how these colonial powers should pay back for the damage they've done, and what they should be accountable for, right? For all those reasons, side government takes today's debate.
Deputy Prime Minister to open the case for opposition and invite you to the opposition.
Okay. Looks like SAS is finally going to break the semi-final case, since government over here gave out too many contradictions. First thing, they said they want sovereignty to be breached, but then they said that, oh, sovereignty won't be money will then be used by the company, will then be used by these compensators to actually fix the country, but then you say that no legislation will be harmed in this process. Where do you stand in this debate again? We also don't know. But let's move on into the rebuttal to today's debate, in which the idea here is that is colonization fine in the first place? Looks like government here needs to actually revise history back, in which we say it's completely a no-no because it's against the Atlantics Amendment in the first place, where colonization has already become something that is discouraged since the 1980s. But why was that amendment created in the first place? Because we tell you that when a country gets colonized, the freedom of the people inside the country itself is restricted. How we can see that? Malaysia themselves. The people inside the country had actually suffered from a social gap between the racial ethnics, and also people couldn't actually create huge development because of this, because of the exploitation of these companies towards of these countries towards the country that will be colonized on how they want to actually run the country in the first place. But then the other question is it harming towards this country, meaning to say that this country who gives compensation has the right to control on how that money has to be funneled in the first place. Example, in the first place, like how Russia actually gives the money to Ukraine, and then therefore Russia has the rights on how that money should be used inside Ukraine itself in the first place. Meaning to say, under your case, you're also agreeing that these compensators will give this money and then therefore will colonize the country and decide how this country should be run economically. Meaning to say, you're not a democratic country anymore. You're now a fascist country who agrees to dictate over other countries, although that's something that's internationally discouraged in the first place, right? But now you're trying to say that, oh, this is okay. We tell you, calm down. Why? Because right now the compensation is definitely going to disturb the legislation process in the first place. How we can see this? We can see this in the past history inside Malaysia itself, when although they are colonized and although there are local leaders, yet their voices are not heard because these people who controls the country economically, especially because you give the responsibility to us to say how your country should be run, because you say that you're a complete total failure. Therefore, your case isn't any more democratic, your case is fascist, and you're going against your own citizen in the first place, right? But when they look as evolutionary in the first place, no. We can see the example in when Russia wants to help Ukraine in the first place, they weren't looked as evolutionary. They were even looked upon by its own citizens as fascist, undemocratic, people who would try to dictate the whole world in the first place, right? Meaning to say, even if you're trying to compensate these countries for the benefit good, people don't look at that, because people will still think that you should give the rights to independence to other countries as well, regardless of whether or not they fail and regardless of whether or not it's consensual. Meaning to say, you cannot do this. So what is the counter mechanism in our case for today? Before that, yes, Anik.
So compensation doesn't necessarily mean that these compensators get to choose what happens with the money. They're just paying for the damage done. Why?
But before that, let's move on to the counter mechanism, in which when this government has already failed economically, we tell you there's also other alternatives existing inside status quo already, in which you don't need to necessarily ask the help from other countries. You can also ask the help from international banks such as like the IMF, who doesn't have any biased interest in the first place. Meaning to say they are a neutral body who actually gives out money to people, and when that money is returned, they use it to actually help other countries who has failed governments in the first place. In your case, you're allowing these countries to actually use this compensation, to pay this compensation, and let them dictate over the country and exploit them for their own biased interests in the first place, in which this is the thing that side opposition would like to avoid. Therefore, we are being we are on a safer high ground in the first place, right? So done with that, let's move on to the first argument on how it creates a misplace of responsibility in the first place. Because right now, there's a problem here in which there's countries who suffers from this government failure problems, right? And we tell you that it is not their responsibility, first of all, because right now, this colonial powers doesn't actually leave the country just like that. When the colonial power what was it called? They had a proper secession discussion on whether or not how they would like to leave the country. Such as like even in Timor-Leste or even in Malaysia, when they wanted to leave the country, they ensured that this country is already independent to stand on their own selves. They had training programs on how to become political leaders. They had training programs on how to actually run their government, and also they had training programs to ensure that there's no social gap in the first place and to show that there's huge unity inside the country. Meaning to say that this former colonial powers have already done their job to ensure that there's no failure that will happen if they actually leave the country. But what does this mean? It means that when this government, when this government has already failed inside the future, right? It means that this is not anymore the fault of these colonial powers as they've already done their job, but it is the fault of the current government for being so complacent and being so irresponsible of letting its own country to fail in the first place, although these colonial powers have already helped them to go through this process, right? But for that last bit, you guys are complicit. You guys cannot actually blame your own fault onto others. Trying to say that I punched Tariq and necessarily it's Ayan's fault because Ayan once used to teach me how to punch. Oh, alright, so right now we tell you that it's also an inconsistency in your own principle as well, because the country has already agreed that I am independent and I can carry my responsibility as a responsible government by my own self. But suddenly right now you're trying to say that, oh, this is your fault. Meaning to say that country has already an inconsistency in their own principle on how to become a sovereign country in the first place. Meaning to say you guys, your guys' assumption on this country is actually failed because of former colonial powers is assumptions, right? But moving on to the next argument on how stepping stone to be recolonized can happen. Now we've already explained to you how the compensation actually works. It means that this country who gives compensation will have the absolute right to control this money actually is flowed inside the country. Meaning to say that this country have the rights on how this money should be. Sovereignty of the country is now lost, and how it should run its country regarding to their finance. Meaning to say that country enters back into the state of colonization, where the local leaders will lose their powers. The possibilities of the civil rights will be ignored on how they want to live their lives, in which Malaysia is already good already, and we have already gained a huge freedom of power of how we want to live our lives. But if we actually would like to reinstate back British to control ourselves, this will create a bad situation in which these people who doesn't understand how does the people inside this country live their lives will actually suddenly change the way of our life to how to serve this money. And that's why it's very important for us to let the local leaders to be independent on how to actually control government, because they know best. We cannot say this, that we cannot say colonization is good. We think it's a shame for Thai government to do so. Therefore, in the name of democracy, we stand.
Alright, I find the leader of the session. Now talk about the
It's a shame that SARS really can't properly utilize their ears, because they haven't really been listening. My Prime Minister, right? My Prime Minister explicitly told you that we believe that it's okay for you to colonize a certain country, but it's not okay when if you leave it at the worst state, right? Like what happened in British Empire, we don't think it's justified there. And we took also to the stance, we believe that it is the best interest of the former colonized countryside. Now, but a few rebuttals that I would like to start my speech. On the first idea of breaching sovereignty, are we really consent? If the countries already consented to idea they can receive this kind of compensation, we don't think we'll be
breaching that form of sovereignty. Second idea they want to tell us, because they say that it's wrong to colonize because of the amendment that he told us. But we think that it's only wrong for you to colonize a country when you exploit the resources in those countries, but you leave those countries at the worst state, and that country cannot move on. We think that's the wrong with it. That's how we bring up this proposal. And also, he really didn't understand what really happens within our mechanism, right? We're not. What he told us that these countries can dictate on how this former colonized countries on how to use money. So they can fully control this former colonized countries. I don't think so, right? My Prime Minister told you that we're gonna pay compensation, then they can have full power, full authority on how they're gonna use their own money in the first place. That's what we're gonna do. We give them the full power on how to properly, how to properly use their money back. We don't think there will be any form of control. Just giving money, not doing really. To this bit, because Russia, because that people perceive Russia as a means state, being a fascist in first place, but we don't think so. We think paying compensation is a huge help for these failing governments, right? We think it's already justified that, and we think that the perception to this powers, we think that people will see that people are helping this failing government, right? And also it's unfair for you to you make your speech based on one case, which is Russia. We don't think so, and Russia is doing it in the wrong way anyway, because they are doing invasion. But these countries are not invading any country. They're not invading Ukraine or anything. Just helping and paying compensation. That's the thing that we're going to do. And after that, they use anything we want from me. No, thank you, sir. So the alternative is already unjustified, because we wanted this failing governments to use IMF. But what happened a few years ago when Indonesia was failing, that they used loans from IMF, and I think now we see that Indonesia isn't really that much of a good state, a good developed country. These failing companies take a huge loan from IMF, and suddenly they're gonna fail even more. You're exacerbating the problem. No, thank you again. Also, on the idea they believe it's not their responsibility. Still, my Prime Minister had already explicitly told you it's their responsibility, right? I will later explain on, because they said that there are already proper research and discussion. I give a POI. If what he's saying is there's already training and they already had done their job, then why are these governments failing, right? We don't think we don't think if they really did a good job, these governments would fail. We don't think they really fulfill their responsibility as big power. No, thank you again. Also on the idea of complacency, that colonial powers created complacency within the within this failing governments, right? Because they injected complacency within their lives. And the last idea is that we believe it's a stepping stone to be colonized. If he says so, then there's a contradiction in speech. Then where is the amendment that you want to uphold, the Alaskan amendment or anything? Colonize in the future, when there's already an amendment that's saying that it's very wrong for you to colonize a certain country. Again, you don't think it will really happen. Yes, the third speaker.
While your logic, Indonesia got funds from IMF and they're still failing. If Indonesia got funds from their previous colonial powers, how will you ensure that they won't fail?
That is why we'll use our proposal to do it. But Indonesia had already done a job. We'll do it later with other countries that's already failing, right? Now, what did my Prime Minister told you? He told you on the idea of responsibility of colonial powers, that they have infiltrated these nations, that they didn't fulfill their role as a colonial power back then. When these governments are failing, that they have a needed responsibility to that country and must pay compensation. Right? We agree with the fact that the past is the past, but fixing what you have done in the past can help for a better future. That's what we believe. Now, the substantive coming from me is that we believe by paying compensation can help this former colonized countries to develop, right? Because the money that they receive could be a stepping stone for them to properly develop now. Giving $200 to this company. We're talking about the money that's already needed, and at least 50% for this country that's needed for this country to develop. We think that that amount of money can really be used for them to properly develop now. No, thank you again. Because we believe that proper development in utilizing and exploiting their own resources, that will thus making the economy and the lives of their citizens better when they use this economy, when they use this money properly, right? We think it's the best way. But how do we really ensure that these former colonies can use the money for good use? But we must take that this form of logic that when these failing governments had already this failing government had already have the proper responsibility to fix and get back together by themselves, right? These failing governments must fix themselves. When they do receive this kind of money, we think there's an assurance that these governments can fulfill their responsibility better and use the money for the right way. For that, yes. Right now, you have already considered. That's what it must be. I'm telling you right now that they already have this kind of responsibility for them to help the economy because they're already failing. Everything this is a stepping stone for them to improve, right? Everything is the best way for them to develop their own economy. They already have a greater push and a greater incentive for them to use the money properly because they're already failing. When you're in a desperate state, you need all the help you can get. And when there's already someone who's going to give you help, why are you not fulfilling responsibility and just receive that money of compensation, right? And also in a moral, it's never morally wrong for you to help a failing government. It's never morally wrong for you to help a failing person, right? Because it's the best way for us to help these failed governments. And so, what have I told you, man? With my premise, I told you on the idea of responsibility of colonial powers. I told you on the idea that is by paying compensation can help former colonies to develop, right, by using the money properly. And there's already an assurance that they can use the money properly. And we believe that by helping to improve better and to develop properly now later in the future, and it's the best interest of these former colonized countries. Thank you.
Okay, guys, let me remind you that speak in harsh tones because we don't want to disrupt the speakers, right? It's best that you don't speak for the speakers. I thank the Deputy Prime Minister. I know you are the Deputy Leader of Opposition.
Thank on British colonization, and we all know that colonization is bad. So look at MCKK. You see, and then even if they are bad as well and they are terrible, is it the fault of the Great Britain itself to compensate for the terribility of MCKK? No, right? And then if MCKK gets this compensation, is then MCKK responsible enough to make good use of the money? What a shame, side government. But then let's just continue with the rebuttals, right? So number one, they are not clear enough on the 50% of why. So this is already a big flaw in their case. And also on the second point, which is sovereignty isn't reached in their case with compensation. Now we tell you money is a very big influence. Money runs the country, money runs the economy. And how can you say that money doesn't bring any influence towards the country? And talk about they don't even consent when they already consent that they are going to have the money. They don't even consent that how the money is going to be used because they are already irresponsible. So these paying countries, these former colonial powers are going to take over them, which already makes them irresponsible to govern the country itself. Also, they talk about how compensation is government's responsibility, which also I've already told you that it's irresponsible
and how this country can develop, and how can you prove that this government can run the country back when they are already irresponsible, and how can they develop when this country are already exploiting them? And they also say on the final issue, which is it's not morally wrong to help this failed government. But then, is it morally right to let these countries to help to exploit their own country and the economy? But then I've already clarified with the rebuttals. Before I move on to my two substantives, which is about further complacency on many parts of this compensation, which yes, Anik.
So, do you think under your paradigm, right, as a visceral reaction to the problem itself, do you think this money should be utilized to actually help the country actually reach some form of development?
No. How are you going to develop the country when you are already irresponsible enough to govern the country as a whole? How can you have the money when you cannot even keep the money? Even if you have this wallet, it can just go away because you are irresponsible. Like that. But then, sit down. I'm going to tell you about the first substantive, which is further complacency. What happens when their case is set to trial? The problem with compensation is that they are imminent to be capitalized by this big by this foreign colonial powers, and because of this government have already failed, this is also making the government to be too lenient to this money and this compensation, right? And this is also not generating the revenue for themselves. When these people already know they are getting this money, then the workforce of this country has already failed, the government already failed, then this country just very terrible, it still won't resolve in their case. And also on the second level, how this biased interest of these former colonial powers, when they pay this money for them, these countries which are paying also have the right to decide how and where the money is funneled and why is this harmful, right? Because it also brings a substantial amount of influence, such as I've already told you before, and these paying countries have also the opportunity to exploit the countries which have already failed, and these countries can find a way to make these countries which receive this compensation to pay them back. So this is why it's a very big exploitation and a very detrimental harm in government's case. Now I've already told you on the substantives. Before that, you.
Now let's flip back to question. How are you so sure that these failing governments don't know how to use their own money?
How many times I have to tell you? You have already failed to govern the country. You cannot even keep your money. And how can you tell us when you get the money, you are going to govern the country itself? Governments, these former colonial powers can exploit your economy, and then your case or default. But also on the second substantive about social tensions, right? Although this government have failed and they receive this compensation, this is going to create much further social backlash in both countries, which the country is paying and also the country is receiving compensations, right? But let's just start with company that is paying, right? The economy of the country, such as the Great Britain, which have already colonized Malaysia, has already very stable economy for their country itself. Meaning that to say that the civilian workforce as the main backbone of this country have already generated much income for this country. But that doesn't mean that this country where these civilians work for and serve for this country have also to work and serve for another country which they have already colonized before. And because of this is why they have to work extra harder to make the country itself to pay the compensation. Not only this destabilizes the big country itself, millions of people in Great Britain just have to work extra harder just to pay for the compensation, right? So this is why it's harmful, right? And because of these several people, these several billions are affected, how can you say that there are not going to be riots? There are going to be riots. People are going to be infuriated. People are going to say that, why are we having to work for this money so that when we already have worked for this government, they are going to pay for these countries that they have colonized before. This is just unjust and this is just unfair. Sit down. And also, this already have burdened them. Just because history says that they have colonized these countries doesn't mean that they are having to work very extra harder to pay back for these countries that they have colonized, right? But then, also on the second level, which is the country that is receiving compensations, right? Such as in Ukraine, which is also a legit example I've told you, such as told by the first speaker of opposition. In Ukraine, this heavy reliance of the country itself, which is backed up of think that this term independence is just a kindergarten word, because they know that they've already been independent. But then with the compensation itself, they think that this government thinks that they cannot govern and they cannot run the country by themselves, they cannot generate the economy themselves. This also creates social tensions of the society towards their own government itself. So this is why it's very detrimental in opposition's case. Now, I've already told you our opposition's stance, which is we are totally disagreeing with government's case, because it has already been flawed since the first case. And also, these former colonial powers also have trained this country's representative to run these governments properly, and also they are responsible and liable for the country as a whole. So that means that they are responsible, these representatives are responsible, not the people who have colonized them before. With that, side opposition is going to go to finals.
Yeah.
All right. I thank the deputy leader of opposition, and I invite the Bick and sign up.
There has been a huge confusion under opposition's case, because they tried to base their arguments on the initially at the initial state, because of the initial state the government has been failing from the start, therefore compensation is no longer relevant. That is their proposal. But what we see in today's debate is actually the otherwise. Well, these governments actually fail because of them. These colonial powers actually leave them that way in the first place. We already told you on the idea that we are going to be on predicating the arguments upon where these colonial powers were the cause of these governments failing in the first place. We already told you that, and but they have been disregarding the whole arguments that we have been telling you. The first issue of this debate was about responsibility. They tried to tell you on the idea, and they shifted our points into telling that it was the responsibility of the national banks in the first place. But we believe no. IMF has lots of other responsibilities and more than 150 countries to compensate in the first place, to help them develop. We don't think that they should take this burden in the first place. And we believe these colonial powers who actually made these governments fail to that extent should be take this burden, because this damage was already too far of an extent in the first place for this IMF to actually take this to actually take this burden. Secondly, on the idea that this leave these countries through proper secession. First of all, this is really an inaccurate representation of the whole idea of colonizing a country in the first place. You can't really assure that every colonial power, when a colonial power actually leaves the country, so therefore they will go through proper secession and all that. You can't really assure that this proper secession or this proper process is actually implemented. So therefore, the non-assurance of this proper process already shows that there is a flaw in these colonial powers in the first place. So we do see a certain level of extent that which these colonial powers are at fault or at stake in the first place. So therefore they should amend their mistakes in the first place, and they have this certain level of responsibility. Since they have left the government that they have been colonizing failing, so that the mistakes that they have done. Before that, yes, go.
First of all, right, this when they had this colonization, it was in the past. But in the past, when we instituted, they've already made sure that these countries are surely independent and doesn't have any problems when they left. Why is it not suddenly their problem?
Look, when a colonial power actually leaves the country, does that mean colonial powers really wants to leave that country, or these people, of these colonized people who actually fought for independence in the first place. We do believe it goes both ways, but we believe the more major cases which this nation actually fought for independence in the first place. So therefore, they don't want these colonial powers to actually come and invade their countries in the first place. So we do believe these countries or these problems that have been caused by these colonial powers are solely based on these colonial powers, and it wasn't the fault of this government in the first place. Second level of rebuttal, they try to tell you on the idea colonial powers were not the fault in the first place, but it could be. It was solely the fault of the government in the first place. They should prove to you how the government, how it was solely the government's fault in the first place, but they didn't do that a good job in that. And secondly, on the idea of breach of sovereignty, we don't think that that could actually fly under their case, because they try to tell you any form of compensation could actually, from colonial powers, could actually mean that it is a breach of sovereignty. We don't think so. Then therefore, if you actually tell money to a country, so therefore you suddenly break that sovereignty process, we don't think that universal trade or any form of trade or any flow of money for a different country is a breach of privacy in the first, it's a breach of sovereignty in the first place. Because they try to assimilate the idea of money flowing from a colonial power to the colonized country is a form of breach of sovereignty. We don't think so, because it's really clearly irrelevant to say that in the first place. Because this compensation is known to help these countries to develop in the first place, knowing that they are the ones who caused them to fail. So that assistance for them to actually develop in the first place, because they were the cause behind the reason, and they were the cause of destruction of the whole country from the start. But last one, yes.
Regardless sovereignty is breached or where you get the money from, how can you prove that the government is responsible enough to utilize the money when the government have already failed?
First of all, the government could have failed because of the absence, could have failed because of the absence of this colonial power. But secondly, the country could have been capable of actually managing this compensation in the first place, but just like that they do have a compensation in the first place. Therefore, they can't actually manage their own country if they don't actually receive a form of compensation. We do believe that they can actually be responsible enough to actually manage this compensation if they do get one in the first place. If we go to the side of opposition, then we do believe they can't manage themselves because they don't have any form of compensation to begin with. So there is no form of assistance or whatsoever coming from their case. So therefore, we really can't actually work, and then they can't be upheld as a normal country even after being colonized by the colonial power. And thirdly, on the idea of stepping stone for recolonization. Firstly, it is clearly an inaccurate representation. How it actually says this compensation is actually a hidden agenda to actually recolonize a country. We don't think that that is actually an accurate representation. Even if it does happen, we don't think that this country, this nation of this country, will actually let that happen again in the first place. The fact that this nation has been free and has been granted independence from these countries in the first place shows that there were certain efforts that could actually make them independent again. Even if it does happen, we do believe that they will be remain independent, and we don't think that that will actually happen in the first place, because they failed to prove to you how these cases of hidden agendas could actually be assured under our case, which clearly makes the point false. So therefore, what have we told you in this debate? We told you on the idea of these colonial powers in the first place. The fact that they have made these governments fail, they make the colonized countries' governments fail. So therefore, we do believe that they should have a certain level of responsibility and a moral obligation to actually help this country improve themselves once again. And secondly, on the idea of how it actually benefits this country once you are actually given this compensation. We do believe compensation is a good step to go in the first place, and we don't think whatever points that they've been given has been relevant in today's debate. So therefore, we believe the government has been standing in this debate from the start. Thank you.
Right, attacking the way from side government, and now talk about the way from side opposition.
Firstly, I point out to see how morally abhorrent it is that MCKK are okay with the idea of colonization in the first place, whereby the world and national level. But also, we think it's abhorrent that they're okay with an idea to say that actually a country can go colonize another country as long as after that it pays for 50% of that. Means that they're principally okay with that. We think it's wrong in this certain sense. But also, they give a really wrong representation of colonization in the first place, whereby they have been really inconsistent. First, they say it's good, where you go in to help a country. After that, they say it's bad and infringing sovereignty. We don't know where MCKK stand, whereby we tell you colonization has been done in the past and it was never good, Mr. Chair. We told you that it's bad and for personal interest of this country that is colonizing and it creates an oppressive regime. This is how it's bad, but it's kind of this is how it's bad, but it's kind of weird how they're still okay with this. Just to point out. So first issue of today and the most important one: is it the responsibility or fault of colonial powers if the government of colonized countries fail? Side opposition has told you no, but the only parameter as to why they told us no was because damage is done when this colonial power left. Then all their arguments already fall into this debate. Sit down, guys, I'll take you in a bit. Why is it not that countries fall in the first place? Because colonial powers already left a long time ago, and the failure of the government doesn't mean that it's the responsibility of colonial powers. Because when colonial powers leave, they already leave this place in a very good state or status. International law, by actually telling you that the Atlantic Amendment in 1980 has already stated that if you want to, that has already discouraged colonization and encouraged all the countries who are colonizing other countries to leave. But when they leave, it also added another thing in the amendment that if they were to leave a country, they have to leave the state in the best state possible, whereby it's fit to run as an independent state. We give you an example of British in Malaysia, whereby before they even left us and give us independence, they have done these trainings and discussions. They have told us how to run a country, how to keep it politically, economically, and socially stable. They ensured that Malaysia had, number one, a stable good racial status between the three major races, whereby no more problems are happening at a certain extent. This means that if a government of a certain country is failing, they shouldn't ask somebody who isn't affiliated with this problem to solve this in the first place. This is why we tell you that damage wasn't done in the first place. If it was done, then these countries already solved this, because there was already an international law to tell you this, and we even give you examples. We don't see any proof coming from MCKK over here. Sit down, guys. But even if damage is done, we still tell you it's principally wrong for you to ask a country that has previously colonized you just to pay, as it will cause more external harms, which I'll analyze later in my speech. But also, moving on, this is why onto the first issue, we tell you this is why it's not the fault of colonial powers and not their responsibility to suddenly cater to you if you are dying in the first place. Before I move on to my second issue, yes, the last one.
If countries that are colonizing a different country are only supposed to leave when the country that they colonize is stable, why did Indonesia and Portugal leave Timor-Leste?
Well, because Indonesia actually to leave them. Read up on history. Second issue of today: will paying compensation to previously colonized countries solve this problem of the failure of that country in the first place? Side opposition has said no, but they told us why our alternatives like IMF will be ineffective. Well, first response, they never even stated the delineation between who gives and why it's so important. Because we tell you it's mutually exclusive. We don't, because they have even stated that, for example, of Indonesia, why IMF have given them funds before this, it still has not been working. Which is why we think that our case setup is much more better. Because we get loans from the international communities, bodies, and banks, and we tell you, for example, the IMF, and this because it's a neutral body, this is why it's much more better. Because now you won't have a feeling to compensate back to that previous country. This is why it's detrimental under their side. Sit down. But also, they never even told us why under our paradigm, when we give money to these countries, they told us that these countries won't use it. But suddenly when the colonial powers give money to these countries, then these countries will suddenly use it. Inconsistency there. Because we identified government being ineffective at the first place, meaning to say, no matter how many funds you want to give to this certain failing state, it will not work. Just because this is not the problem of who gives the aid, but because if you give aid anyway, this country will already fail. under their logic. This is why we don't see that how their case is so exclusive and why our alternatives are much more better. Sit down, and MCKK, I'm not taking anymore. But also, why will this not solve the problem of failure? Because we told you how it creates a complacency within the failing gulfs and works in a backward mobility. How now countries are initially independent and can cope with themselves, but now they know that they have a safety net. If they fail, then they can ask for their funds for 50% of their construction to be paid back. This creates complacency, lax, and unproductive government, whereby they are reliant on another country, one, but secondly, it means that these countries have no incentive to improve in the first place because they just know they can just get more money. We don't see how this is going to help solve the problem. Sit down. But also, we told you how it creates a shift of responsibility, whereby a country is in of that you're desperate, and this creates a shift of responsibility that now not your own government is responsible over you, but your colonial powers is responsible over you. This hampers the credibility of the government. This is how it's creating a shift of responsibility. This is why they lose the second issue. No way. But also we told you this is why even if you pay compensation to previously colonized country, it will not solve the problem of that country failing in the first place. They failed to clear up their burden. I'm not taking any more. Last issue: will paying compensation to the colonized countries bring more repercussion or benefits? Opposition has said benefits. We tell you repercussions. How? First harm is that it creates social tensions on two levels. Firstly, social tensions within the countries that pay compensation in the first place. We told you about how society will be angered and dissatisfied to know that they are working, that their taxpayers' money is going to another country in the first place. But secondly, is that it's a perceptional harm towards the countries that receive this compensation in the first place. Because they're independent, their state should make their own money. But now you're somewhat submitting a proportionate of the But second harm is that how it leads a stepping stone to biasness. Their rebuttal to biasness was that opposition argued that colonial powers won't decide where the funds go. We tell you that they still will, for the fact that they are injecting these funds in the first place. It means that they still have a say somewhat to this certain extent where the money goes. Because of this, because they have shown before this personal interest in colonizing this country, we don't think that it's impossible to do this again. Maybe even whereby we think that they have an ulterior motive while giving this compensation, because now this country is accountable to them, you're letting them get more influence, and it just might lead to another Ukraine and Russia, with something that they didn't give any examples of. This is why we give more proof and are more credible in today's debate. This is why we tell you paying compensation to colonized countries brings more repercussions than benefits. This is why they were contradictory in their stance. We don't know where they stand, but also this is why SAS is breaking our semi-finals curse.
Alright, I find the wave from side opposition. Close the case for side opposition. I invite you back.
There's a huge confusion in today's debate, where side government over here wants colonization, but then they say, oh, they will be colonized, but then they say, oh, colonization is good, and we want them to do so because this former colonial powers are much more credible, but then they say, oh no, we're going to let them independent. But regardless of what, right, we'll still think that our arguments will stand tall in today's debate, although we're talking about harms of when this is to actually repair the damages that exist inside the country in the first place, right? So meaning to say that if you still continue to inject this money, and this government who has already failed don't have any incentives to actually try to repair back the damage because there's such a failing government in the first place, and you're not giving any proof to us on how this government would suddenly become successful at the end of the day, and therefore this former colonial powers will still have to continuously inject money inside this country. Meaning to say, at one point, this former colonial powers would want to ensure that the compensation they give would be something effective at the end of the day. Meaning to say that they will control over the country's economy by actually letting the money to be controlled as how they want it to be used in the end of the day. So therefore, our arguments still stand. Your stance, we don't know what is your stance, right? So let's move on with the first issue in today's debate. is it the responsibility of the former colonial powers in the first place? Because opposition said, yes, this damage is obviously done by the previous colonial powers because are trying to say that MCKK students are still gay because SAS has been there before, right? But we already told you, like, SAS are very Iman students, and then we've already like tried to make them much more better. But if they're still gay, it's not our fault, right? So it's still similar in this kind of situation in which that the British have already upheld their responsibility. The British have already upheld the penjajah Tanah Melayu to ensure very, very responsible in becoming independent as well. Even they actually created a shadow cabinet to give them temporary time to conduct the country on how they want to be, and it has already been proven successful. They've already been proven to be independent and responsible. Therefore, we leave. But then, if they commit another mistake, if they become a huge failure, that is not anymore the former colonial powers' fault. That is your fault. So, therefore, is it the responsibility of the former colonial powers? We say no. We say it's yours. But then, here's the second issue. Can the country develop after this? Let's look at the two perspectives because they've been very confusing in today's debate, right? Well, I've already continuously tell you, right? Since this government has already failed and wanted to ask compensation because they've become too much dependent on other countries who have already become successful, suddenly you are sure that this money given to them will suddenly be efficient in being used. We tell you that you don't provide any mechanical changes on how they could develop better since they've already failed. So therefore, your only alternative is to actually allow the country, the former colonial powers, to actually allow them to actually control this money in the first place. But what are the harms? It means that you cannot actually develop at all because the country obviously would be run as how they wanted to, and how in the previous history, when countries become colonized, and the harms that existed during that time will be repeated again into this because these countries have biased interests in the first place. Explain Russia and Ukraine, in which when Russia and Ukraine was already segregated and already was given secession, therefore suddenly Russia would suddenly want back Ukraine, and there was a clear biased interest in them trying to take over Ukraine and also exploit it. You want to colonize again is totally assumptions, right? So who solved the problem better in today's debate? Coming from side government, you guys are not solving at all because we already tell you that you guys want to actually create another colonization era, which all the harms that exist during that time will exist again because these people don't even understand how the people inside that country live their lives. Therefore, the local leaders' voices will also not be heard at the same time, and therefore they think that they are the best in creating decision making. And therefore, we tell them that this is harmful, and therefore we should let them independent. And also because of social tensions that will be created if you allow this, such as like what happened in Russia and also Ukraine, we cannot allow this to happen. So our counter mechanisms still stand tall. Although you're trying to give the reason that IMF is busy, we tell you that it's still the best way, although there's a single flaw in it. So therefore, we win today's debate. We are going to finals.
Vice speaker from side opposition. To end this debate, I invite the vice speaker from side opposition.
If there was one thing the British did teach MCKK, it's how to be a gentleman. Unlike SAS over here. So let's move on with the issues in today's debate, right? Let's start with the issue in today's debate. Firstly, on the idea of the breach of sovereignty, right? So first of all, we came up here and we told you how it's never a breach of sovereignty here and say that it becomes breach of privacy when you compensate and when you actually or sovereignty when you compensate and when you actually choose what happens to the money, right? But we tell you it's never a breach of sovereignty because with the money that you get, it's up to you whether to make the right priorities, right? So we think under our paradigm, where this country is at a very at an economical crisis, we think that the visceral reaction to solve the problem is to act with the money in justified means, right? So that's why we think that under our paradigm, the use of money, these countries are going to utilize the money to the best extent, unlike their assumption here, right? So we think that that fails right there. But more importantly, right, we told you how these compensators don't choose at the end of the day, and we think that they had no response to this, and this issue was won by us. Secondly, on the idea of complacency, right, they told us how complacency doesn't happens because now when we give them money, they can always use colonization as an excuse to get money. That we want them to pay 50% as to initiate the form of development, right? Yet they come up here and give an assumption telling us that these people will continuously depend every time that the economy goes to a downfall. We think that's a huge assumption coming from the case, and we don't think that's fair. But more importantly, they also told us how, but more importantly, we tell you, right, that this complacency doesn't really happen because they want this money. It's because they need this money, right? Because we told you in my whip speech how the idea of complacency doesn't happen when these people actually fought for independence for the sole reason of getting rid of help from colonial powers. But at the end of the day, we think that when in desperation, that's when we claim compensation for the damages that has been done, right? So we think that that's particularly fair. More importantly, because we think that the problems that they've caused, the damages that they've caused, has never been accounted for by anyone. So we think this is the opportunity we take for them to but more, and on the issue, on the idea of social tensions, right? They tell us social tensions happen for the sole reason of other people compensating us, and how the idea of gaining independence becomes irrelevant, right? We told you that social tensions are not originated from the idea of paying compensation. As a matter of fact, we even told you that compensation is something that people actually want for because they feel as though they've been harmed by a certain party, and we told you how it's fair and we get better support from society, especially need this money, and that the blame is on the people who caused these damages, right? That's exactly why we see that you gain societal support rather than societal tension, that what they have propagated in their speech, right? So what have side government done in today's debate, right? We told you, we took the stance that we want to prove to you what's in the best interest of these colonized countries, in which we told you exactly how important it is and how fair it is for these colonial powers to actually pay back the compensation, and how they deserve. Importantly, we also told you exactly how the idea of compensation is going to help spark the development in these countries itself and lead to a better idea of development as a whole, and we think that they serve the purpose in changing societal perception towards them, who's always been a dictatorial force. Now they can change that perception and say that we are taking responsibility for our actions, and we think that is extremely important. For all those reasons and more, we will see you in finals.
I'd like both teams for the debate. We cross the score. The results will be announced at
the call. Move, have lunch now. Motions for final.